Thank you, Zoom, for that prompt. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for being here for this edition of Birds and Bytes. We're back after a 15 episode run in 2020, bleeding into the early 2021. We took a nice long summer break. You know, we were all sick of the Zoom thing, heading back out into the world and enjoying the warm weather and pseudo post-COVID times. Not really, but whatever. Point is, we're back though. We've retooled the program. We're very excited for all the amazing speakers and events we've got coming up over the next several months here. Already, the rest of 2021 is scheduled. You can actually see that on our website, what those events are. And we have many more coming in the new year as well. So we're very excited about this program. And we're especially excited this evening to have our guest, Mikko Jimenez, who will be our speaker here tonight. So a couple of quick notes here real quick. So first and foremost, like I mentioned, we are recording. So if you would not like to be heard making awkward noises in the background or seen, please go ahead and make sure you remain muted and keep your camera off. I will also be coming through here with the mute hammer mercilessly if you're making noise while Mikko is talking. And on that note, we're going to save the questions for the end of the program, but once he is done, we will have a Q&A session afterwards. So bank your questions and be ready to throw them his way when he's done. Additionally, this is a program brought to you by Chicago Ornithological Society. My name is Edward. I am president of COS. And if you are not a member already, why not? For basically the price of like a fancy six-pack or a dinner out, you can be a member of this awesome organization and support really cool programs like this, which are free, open to the public, and are just crazy awesome and informative. So and finally, if you would like to get out with us out in the field, we are back doing in-person bird walks and occasional in-person program as well. So just hop over to our website, chicagobirder.org, where you'll find our events, our awesome blog, etc., and other ways that you can join and engage with us and the birding community. But that said, without further ado, you didn't come here to listen to me talk. I'm going to pass it over to Mikko. So please give him a warm round of applause, fanfare in the chat. You're the thumbs up icon or applause icon. Thank you, Mikko. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Edward. And thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, get my slides up. Can I just get a thumbs up, Edward? Does this look, am I seeing the right, did I share the right thing? All right, great. Yeah, thank you so much for joining tonight. As Edward said, my name is Mikko Jimenez. I'm currently an outreach biologist for Audubon's Migratory Bird Initiative, but I'm actually transitioning over to being a full-time PhD student at Colorado State University. And so I'll be talking about two different projects today, one that I've been working on at Audubon, and then one that I will be working on for my PhD. But they both fall under this kind of big umbrella of big data and bird migration, and kind of more specifically, how we can start to use big data to protect migratory birds, and looking at a couple, I guess, two projects that are already kind of doing this. And I also just want to quickly say, thanks for having me, Edward. This is a really great program. I've actually been following it for a while and watched a couple of these. So I'm just really stoked to be here. And on that note, I know that the Birds and Bytes, is a play on Birds and Beers, which were held in kind of pre-COVID times. And this is actually a picture of me at one of those. I think this is like 2016 or 2017. So it feels like I'm in good company. I'm really stoked to be here. And on that note, I actually want to, obviously I'll be talking about bird migration, but I want to start with, I guess, an example that's a little closer to home for Chicagoans and kind of all city people in general, which is just talking about taking the train, right? So I think, as a lot of Chicagoans know, we use the CTA to get around, the train lines, the bus lines. And so I think this is kind of a really, I guess, what's it called? Easy way to kind of get to a point that I want to make. And when I was in this, living in the city, I lived in Pilsen, and I was working at the Urban Wildlife Institute, which is at the Lincoln Park Zoo. And I would take the train every day. I was living in Pilsen, so I'd get on at the 18th stop on the Pink Line, make my way north to transfer on the Brown Line, go over to Fullerton, and then walk to the zoo. So this is one potential route that you could take as a commuter on the CTA. And it turns out that the CTA actually takes data on how people move around the city and how people are using, ridership essentially. And this is just one route of the 1.6 million rides that happen every day, at least pre-COVID, across the CTA. And so why do they take data on this type of thing, on ridership? It's for things like statuses and alerts, right? If a train line goes down or if a stop is, not functioning, you can kind of figure out, or they can figure out how to kind of reroute people, take bus lines, things like that. This is also why we have the Purple Line, right? So the Purple Line is this commuter. It's a line that runs express during commuting hours, and it was really set up so that we could kind of accommodate that extra need for more trains during commuting hours, especially along kind of common lines that are used. And then this is also how we, as Chicagoans, kind of all know to avoid Grant Park during the infamous weekend that is Lollapalooza, right? When hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of inebriated teens make their way into the city, and we all kind of know to just step back and not deal with it. So this is kind of a cheeky example, but I think it's the point I'm trying to make here is that because we take data on the CTA ridership, we can make kind of informed management decisions, right? And I think that kind of central idea is if we know when and where things are moving, we can actually make management decisions that are driven by data to help them get where they're going. And I think this is the age that we're starting to enter with birds. There's been a lot of bird migration research we're collecting a lot of data on bird movement and bird migration in particular. And I think we're really living in an exciting time when we're starting to use those data and we're starting to be able to kind of use those data to inform how we protect them exactly. And so this is kind of a thread throughout my whole talk. I'll be talking about what we know about where birds migrate and how we can kind of use those data to protect birds, as well as what we know about when birds migrate. And so for each of these, I'll be talking about one project that I've been working on or will be working on that kind of seeks to answer those questions. And so first I'll be talking about this first question of what do we know about where birds migrate? And the answer is honestly, we've come a really long way and we still have a lot more to learn. So if we back up 200 years, Alexander Wilson is a well-known ornithologist. He's who we currently name the Wilson's Warbler after. And so just 200 years ago, he wrote this in American Ornithology, The Natural History of the Rail, and I think he was talking about Sora here using context clues, is a profound and inexplicable mystery. It has been supposed by some that they bury themselves in the mud during winter, he's talking about. So, and then he goes on to explain how ornithologists would actually go out and in the middle of the winter and try to dig up mud flats and try to find where the rails went. So just think about that. 200 years ago, that was kind of a leading ornithologist's thought as far as to where rails go in the winter. If we fast forward to today, we know a lot more because we're taking a lot of data. Two facts off the bat that are kind of large scale. We know that more than 70% of North American birds migrate, and that's by species. And then a lot of those species that migrate spend more than half of the year on stopover or wintering grounds, right? So those two facts alone, I think, really color, I guess, how we start to think about conserving them. Because if a lot of species are migratory and they're spending a lot of their time not, across the entire Western Hemisphere, then only focusing on breeding grounds is really not enough, right? We have to think about where they are as they migrate and where they're wintering and those kinds of things. So it's really the idea here is that we want to take a full annual cycle approach to conserving migratory birds. And so how do we actually know those things? Well, it's because we take data. People like you go out and collect presence absence data, right? Every time you eBird, you're telling us something about where a bird is at any given time in the year based on your observations. I'm sure a number of you have also been involved with banding projects where we put a band on an individual bird in one place and then we try to recite it or recapture it. And so we can kind of figure out this individual bird was at point A and then we saw it again at point B. So it's kind of connectivity data. It helps us understand different points where an individual bird has been seen. And what we're moving towards and what we've been doing a lot more lately is we're tracking individual birds. So there's a lot of work that's being done now this is a picture of my colleague, Amy Scarpignato, and she has a tracker, she's attached a tracker to an eastern meadowlark here. And so what this does is, we're not only just getting point A and point B, but we're seeing how that bird, the route that it took to get between those two places. So it tells us a lot more about that full annual cycle, even beyond just kind of the point A and point B. And so what the Migratory Bird Initiative is looking to do is really to synthesize these data, right? We want to acquire data from contributors. We want to integrate those the data that's available, and we want to create a standardized data layer for each migratory species. And so the idea here is that we take all those data and we put it into a comprehensive database, or what the result is a comprehensive database of spatial migration information that's accessible to the public, to researchers. Anyone who is interested in bird migration would have access to this database. And so, where does the Migratory Bird Initiative, or MBI, where does it sit within Audubon? Audubon's such a big nebulous group. The idea is that, MBI will really sit and serve as kind of connective tissue between a lot of the different efforts that are going on across Audubon. So, we want to use the best available science to inform policy and conservation action on the ground. And MBI, the hope is that MBI will kind of sit in the center there of all those different things that Audubon and many other institutions are working on. And on that note, I just want to quickly say, it really does take a hemisphere. We have been working with a lot of external institutions. There are just numerous institutions and different research groups and community members, professional and community scientists that we've been working with on this. This is not something that we're doing alone. It's a very collaborative effort, and we're trying to keep it that way. Okay, so that's the overall goal for MBI, but what does that actually look like in practice, right? So this is a schematic, I guess, of the different steps that we need to take to get to that kind of end goal, that mission statement that we have. So first, we need to acquire and standardize the data. And then once we have it, we want to make visualizations and mapping tools that different stakeholders, different conservationists, just anyone in the public can interact with. And then we want to use those mapping tools. We want to get them in the hands of whoever's interested. And we really want them to inform advocacy and at-home actions for conservation. And so that's kind of one pipeline that we have. It's like getting the data, creating tools, and then getting it in the hands of people who are interested. But then there's also kind of this full service pipeline where we have the data, right? We've standardized and acquired it, and we can actually just use it to inform the work that is already being done on the ground for conservation. So, taking those data and having the Audubon science team really use them to direct Audubon efforts directly. So there's kind of two approaches here, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to show some examples of the mapping tools, and then I'm just going to kind of talk more broadly about what our approach is to the full service kind of conservation applications track here, I guess. So I had talked about these three different ways that we've been collecting data. There are more than this, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to focus on these, and they can really be kind of binned or categorized into accordingly as occurrence data. So again, presence, absence, where was the bird, or I saw the bird at this point in the year at this area. A re-encounter data. So again, I saw this individual bird at point A and then again at point B. And pathway data. So again, how it got from point A to point B. And so we can use these data and we can synthesize them to actually create these interactive maps. And that's what we've been working on for the Migration Explorer as part of the Migratory Bird Initiative. So I'm going to go through and talk about three different examples of these maps and before kind of moving to how we want to use these data to inform conservation. So first I'll be talking about full annual cycle maps, and I'll be using the prothonotary warbler as an example. So I'm going to keep this running on loop, and I'm just going to talk through exactly what you're seeing. So, you behind all of, I guess, the dots that are moving around, you have these, the species ranges, the summer wintering and year-round ranges for this particular species. So those are static, they're not moving, right? And that's what you see if you open up a field guide or anything like that. But you also see these dots moving around, and so it'll play again. And I'll talk about that attribution page in a second. But these are actually individually tracked prothonotary warblers. I should say the big dots are individually tracked prothonotary warblers that researchers went out and tagged, and this is the path that they seem to be taking based on the data. And then behind those kind of big orange dots, it'll play one more time. Behind those big orange dots, there are those kind of black, little dots that are moving around as well. And those are actually species relative abundances that are taken from eBird. And so it's really cool. You can see how the eBird data really lines up well with like the timing of what we're seeing with those bigger individually tracked birds. So I'm going to play it one more time. So these birds in particular winter in northern Colombia, make their way across the Gulf or along the Atlantic coast. They breed in North America, and then they make their way back down to northern Colombia. And then I'm going to pause it here. Just want to talk about our attribution page, right? So as I said, there's a lot of people that are working on this with us. This is a very collaborative effort. So in this case, the tracking data that you saw was provided by folks like Chris Tonner and Mike Hallworth, and from a study that the data were taken from a study that they published a couple of years ago now. And so, it's really important to us that we make sure we get the attribution right. And so for all of our products, there will be attribution pages that accordingly. So that's the full annual cycle map for the prothonotary warbler. Next, I'm going to talk about, Next year, I'm going to talk about our connections maps, which are another way of kind of showing these data. So connections maps, they basically show two individual points, two hexagons, and they basically show how many individual birds have been seen at, like, again, that point A and that point B. And so I'm going to show a map that highlights Chicago in a second here. But I just want to kind of explain how this works up front before I show the whole map. So basically the darker the hexagon you're seeing, the more birds connect Chicago in that hexagon. And so what does that look like for Chicago? Again, this is centered on Chicago, and you can see, Chicago has a lot of birds that move through it and then end up or are seen again along, somewhere in the center of the country. A lot of like dark purple areas here in the Midwest. But I think the cool thing here to look at is just how far a lot of these dots go, right? So a bird that was seen in Chicago, it depends on the species here, but we have birds that pass through Chicago that will end up in, really far south in South America, and then as far north as Alaska, right? And I think this really just puts into perspective, just how big the footprint is for all of the birds that we see across the year in any given place. And so this map is focused specifically on Chicago, Illinois, but the idea behind this kind of explorer is that you'd be able to click any hexagon or kind of input your, your zip code, and you'd be able to see exactly where your home and how it connects to different places across the Western Hemisphere through bird migration. So again, this is another way of kind of showing the data. I also want to say, when we get to Q&A, if you have any specific questions about these maps, we can always come back to them. So just keep that in mind for the Q&A at the end. Lastly, I want to talk about our threats maps. And this is kind of a segue also into conservation applications, because these are probably the most applied of the three kind of maps that I'm showing today. So here as an example, we have a number of raptor data, or maps, I should say, and they're heat maps of where these birds kind of move, the densities with which they move across the country, or I should say the continent. And so we have broad-winged hawk, golden eagle, osprey, turkey vulture, and we can actually overlay those to have a compilation of where all four of those species, all four raptor species, where they move and in what densities. And so red here, warmer colors are going to indicate kind of more higher densities of space use. But what we can do is, which is cool here, is we can actually take, we can take those data and then overlay them with wind power facilities, which we know are a threat to a lot of these larger bodied, in particular, soaring or raptor species, which soar And particularly on migration, that's a huge risk for them, right? And so we can overlay where they spend the bulk of their time, or where they, are most densely spending the bulk of their time across the full annual cycle. And we can overlay that with wind power facilities to really understand, so here I'm seeing in southern Texas, or maybe that's Mexico already, there's definitely some bottlenecks, as well as as we move into Central America, there are definitely bottlenecks where a lot of these species move, and we do see wind power facilities there. So we can kind of highlight areas where we need to be working to protect these species throughout their full annual cycle. And so we can do this with different species, we can do this with different threats, but the idea in general is that we want to use kind of spatial data to understand where we should be working. And this kind of underscores the whole kind of mission of what MBI wants to do as far as using these data. We want to create multi-species prioritizations across the full annual cycle to identify the most important places for migratory birds to unify the Audubon network. And I think this last part, to unify the Audubon network is really key, because, as I said, Audubon's a very nebulous, it's a huge organization. And so if we can kind of identify these areas where we need to be working, it not only kind of connects places, but it also connects people, right? We can start to identify who's already working in those regions, even if it's not an Audubon group, what groups are already working in these places, and how can we kind of add value to whatever they're doing? How can we complement the work that's already being done? So this is what gets me really excited, is that we can kind of narrow in on where we need to be conserving migratory birds, and then through that we can kind of understand what partnerships would be beneficial for birds. So this is this is my overview of MBI, and I think it's doing a really great job of kind of understanding where birds are moving throughout the year. But there is the second question that I brought up that was more kind of temporally focused, of what do we know about when birds migrate? And maybe even more pointedly, how can we predict when birds will be migrating, right? I think it's really great to know when historically birds have been moving, but particularly in an ever-changing world, being able to understand and predict into the future when birds will be migrating is really key to a lot of this work. And so the team that I'll be joining, or working with, I should say, is Birdcast, which I'm guessing a lot of you on this call have heard of. And they've really, again, it's a multi-institution group, but they've really focused in and honed in on this question of, can we forecast migratory movements? And so I'll be talking a little bit about how exactly Birdcast works, and how we actually collect those data and process those data. So Birdcast is North American focused, and what we have across North America are 143 NEXRAD sites. And so NEXRAD stands for Next Generation Weather Radar. And so these radar sites, they're owned and operated by the National Weather Service, and they're primarily used to detect and predict weather systems, right? So they're primarily used to kind of predict weather, but the exciting thing for ornithologists is that we can also use these sites to collect data on bird migration. And so how does this work exactly? Essentially, each of these sites is equipped with a sensor that radiates, it emits radiation, and then it will listen for those radiation waves to come back. And by doing this, it can determine, by determining the time it takes for those waves to come back, and kind of detecting really small changes in the frequency of the returned wave, we can get an idea of what's in the atmosphere, right? What objects are in the atmosphere, and then also which direction they're moving, and how quickly they're moving. And so that's how, this is kind of the simplest way of showing how this works, but obviously it's not focused in on one bird. Instead, you're kind of doing these wide sweeps of the entire atmosphere. And you're not even just doing one sweep of the atmosphere. What they do is they do multiple sweeps at varying angles, right? So this is a graph that's showing, or figure that's showing, on the x-axis here, you have the range of the distance away from the radar site. And then on the y-axis, you have the height above ground. And so it's showing kind of these varying angles at which a radar is taking data. And so it does these sweeps, and what you actually see back on the the computer side of things are these these radar readings that you see to the right of the graph, where you can kind of see how much reflectivity, in other words, like how much stuff is actually in the atmosphere. And by doing that, by taking multiple scans and compiling them, what we get is a vertical profile of everything that's out in the atmosphere. Um, Jeff Williamson, I want to quickly give a plug. Jeff Williamson gave a really great talk, I think it was last year, on birding by radar. And so he goes into a lot more depth about how this actually works. So if you're more interested in the details on this, I'd really suggest you go back and watch his talk. And one thing that he actually pointed out is that I guess the idea that we can detect birds on radar is not actually a new thing. It was noted by scientists as far back as 1945. But what is new and what's exciting about Birdcast and the kind of present day where we are with this is our ability to process and model these data has it's really come into its own, and that's part of why Birdcast exists. So when you turn on the news and you're watching the weather, you'll see something like this, right? Typically, it'll be zoomed into a certain part of the country or a certain region, but what you do see is these weather patterns moving across the country. But what they work really hard to hide from you is this bioscatter. So bioscatter is pretty simply living organisms that get picked up on these radar scans, and you can tell for birds in particular, they really show up as these kind of donut-shaped rings around each of. Right now, it's in this kind of central part of the country, but they're these donut-shaped rings around around each sensor. And by getting a measure of reflectivity, you can actually kind of figure out, approximately how many birds, or at least relatively how many birds are moving through or by that sensor. And so actually at Jeff Williams' talk, just to call back something I said earlier, and I think it's Jeff Williamson, he gave his talk and then he had a really great question that was, if we do the opposite of what weathermen do, and we just take the bioscatter or the birds, is that our golden ticket for understanding bird migration, or is there a lot of data there? And the answer is a resounding yes, and that's exactly what the Birdcast team has done in the past. They have created an algorithm for actually removing non-bird data, and by doing that, we have all this historical data because we have radar going back several decades now. And so, so we have all this historical bird data on bird migration. The answer becomes, how can we actually use those data? And what Birdcast has done is they've created a system for predicting when bird migration events will happen, and particularly large migration events. And so how that actually works is we take those historical data, and then we link them with things that we know are predictive at some level of bird migration. So different variables, things like air temperature, north-south wind, east-south wind, altitude, pressure, relative humidity, all these things, all these atmospheric conditions that we know at some level are predictive of bird migration. And then we link that to the data. So what does that actually look like? This is a schematic of kind of the we'll call it a 4-step process, I guess, of how we take those data and turn it into a migration forecast. So first, we process a bunch of the historical radar data. We call this training data. It's what we use to train the models. Once we have those training data, we learn the associations with those variables that I talked about earlier, those atmospheric or meteorological data. Once we have kind of gotten a feel for those associations, we incorporate them into a machine learning model. And then once we feel pretty good about those models, we can actually use them to predict migration forecasts, right? So this is what the migration forecasts actually look like, with those kind of warmer colors, again, indicating more bird movement. And so, what does this look like in practice? This is a migration forecast from April 26, 2016. Again, the migration intensity is higher at those warmer colors. And so, this is just a forecast. This isn't using any data from 2016. This is just it's making a prediction based on atmospheric conditions. So when we compare this to what we actually observed that night on the radar, we see that this model performed relatively well, right? A lot of these donut shapes that we see a lot around these radar systems um, line up with kind of where we predicted, where these models predicted where the migration would be happening. Um, and so, in this case, this worked really well. I'm sure there are skeptics in the crowd who are wondering, okay, this is one night. How well does this actually work night after night, year after year? And so to take a look at that, my advisor, Dr. Kyle Horton, as well as his colleague, Benjamin Van Doren, they looked at this quantitatively using a value or a metric called R squared. And R squared is basically just a metric of model performance. All you really need to know about it for the purposes of this talk is that if a model performed a 0, that would mean it had no predictive power. It was an absolutely useless model. And then if it performed as a 1, it was absolutely perfect. It predicted everything 100% right. A 1 is theoretically or practically impossible. We're never going to get to 1. But when my advisor and his colleague Benjamin Van Doren kind of looked at where does the birdcast models, where do they line up? So in 2017, for all of the models in 2017, they were sitting at about 0.78. And what that means is that the models in 2017 explained about 78% of the variance that was observed. That's just 1 year. If we look at more years, we see that they all kind of cluster around this and around that value. And what that means is that there's pretty consistent, performance across years with these models. And so we feel pretty good about these values and these models and their ability to predict bird migration. So what do we do with that, right? We have this tool where we can predict when birds will be migrating, and not only just when they'll be migrating, but when a lot of birds will be migrating. I think you can do a lot of different things with it, but one thing that Birdcast has started exploring is this idea of anthropogenic light. So we know that anthropogenic light is an issue for migrating birds. It draws them into urban centers, which can cause them to collide with buildings, which are often fatal events. And even more than that, some birds can use urban areas as stopover. Some birds can't, right? And so for a lot of these birds that get, I guess, drawn to the city, it can, in some cases, be an ecological trap. And so the idea here is that if we know when birds are migrating, we can hopefully identify those nights when bird migration is particularly high and kind of get the word out about reducing anthropogenic light. So things like turning off your lights, both at the personal scale, like your own apartment, but at the city scale, kind of at a municipal scale, getting cities to cooperate and turning off lights in cities to help birds kind of safely get across the landscape. And so this is, as I said, one area where Birdcast has really been exploring. Like I said, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of or have looked at the Birdcast kind of website and are familiar with that interface. But this is what it looks like in case you haven't. I highly suggest going to check it out. We're still in fall migration, so I think there are still forecasts that are coming out. So that's something that you can check for tonight. And this is what the forecasts actually look like. We get these continental estimates of kind of where birds will be moving, or how many birds will be moving as well as where they'll be moving. And so this is kind of an example of 3 nights in April in 2020 of what those forecasts look like. But we can also take these forecasts and kind of directly apply them to get lights out alerts out to the public, right? We can directly kind of inform, I guess, how and when we turn off lights, or I guess where and how we turn off lights based off of the data that we have of when birds will be migrating and where exactly they'll be migrating. So again, this is a project that I will be working on. Birdcast is something that I'll be kind of working on as part of my PhD. And I've kind of given this overview of 2 different projects that I've have been or will be playing a part in. But I really try to, as I'm working on these projects, I really try to keep perspective of, why is this important, right? I'm sure a lot of you have seen this this research that came out just a couple of years ago that showed we've lost about 3 billion birds since 1970. And I think about that a lot, of where does my research fall in that? Like how can I actually help that number improve? And how can we actually conserve a lot of these migratory birds? And even more in particular, what can we do as urbanites, and in particular the Chicago birding community? Even if you're not a birder, even if you're just a Chicagoan, why does this matter, and how is this kind of important to your daily life? Um, One thing I want to bring back is just this map of how connected Chicago is, by birds to different parts of the Western Hemisphere, and even kind of globally, really. Um, Again, the reach, the footprint of, if you see a bird in Chicago, like just how far it might go. It could be as far north as Alaska, or as far south as really South America. And I think that really colors what we can do, because I really think that migration is kind of the ultimate think global, act local scenario, right? Because you can do things at all of these different scales, right? So I kind of organized action items from most global to most local. And so, one thing you could do is support international conservation efforts and legislation. Again, it's not just enough to kind of protect birds where you see them. It's important to take this full annual cycle approach to protecting birds. Um, I think it's important to stay tuned and engage with these projects that I talked about, and as well as other projects. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about bird migration. There's studies that come out every day that just turn what we know about migration on its head. And so, just keeping up to date with the research that's continually coming out, collecting data, as I said, going out and doing an eBird survey. Both of the projects that I talked about have integrated eBird at some level. So it's really incredible the things that we're starting to be able to do with eBird data, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call have contributed to that. So keep doing that. Um, Participate in Lights Out campaigns. I hope I got across just how important those can be, particularly in urban centers. Um, on the other side of things, from my first point, just thinking about and being engaged with local conservation efforts and legislation. And I think that's something that CSO in particular does a really good job of. And then lastly, just tell your friends. It's, conservation will only go as far as, as far as the word gets out. And I think in particular, I say this to everyone and to every audience that I talk to, or any kind of person who's willing to let me rant to them about bird migration, is just one thing you can do is just get the word out there that this is an issue, that birds are declining, and that there's something that you can do on any given day to prevent that. But I think that it's particularly important to this audience of Chicagoans, because I think that Chicago has a really big, in more than just an ecological footprint, social footprint, right? Conservation is both an ecological and a social endeavor. Um, you know, I know personally firsthand what it feels like when the whole city of Chicago is behind I guess, an effort, right? I grew up in the northern suburbs in the 90s, so I'm still a Bulls fan today because the Bulls, I mean, that energy was just infectious, and it's followed me through my whole life. I was in Wrigleyville when the Cubs won the World Series, and I was at the parade. I remember what that felt like. I grew up in high school listening to Chance the Rapper, 10 Day. I used to play on Lakeshore Drive with my friends in high school. And then I watched him literally perform for the president at the White House. This is the city that put big deep dish pizza on the map. This is the city that regularly gets through snow apocalypse. My point here being, if Chicago cares about something, it's the world is going to know. And that holds a lot of weight. And I really feel like once we kind of embed the wildlife in our city into our land ethic and into our civic pride, that's really going to be a game changer, and already is to some extent, for conservation. And as I said, this is already happening in a lot of ways, right? I think CSO has really been a leader in this regard, right? I know that the COS, the Chicago Ornithological Society, has been really engaged with Monty and Rose. How could we forget, right? I was really excited. I got to go back. I live in New York currently, but I got to go back and see Monty and Rose the first summer that they bred. And I know COS was really engaged with organizing Plover Watch, and that a number of you on the call, I bet, were volunteers for that endeavor, and kind of collecting data on them, but also just kind of protecting them and making sure that they had the room that they needed. I also know that COS and a number of Chicago kind of ornithological society and the birding community more at large has been engaged with protecting the oh my gosh, I'm going to blank on the name right now, but the prairie that is in jeopardy as Chicago wants to expand the Rockford International Airport, Bell Prairie, right? Sorry, I'm blanking on that right now, but I know that COS has done a lot of work in this space to kind of engage urbanites in conservation issues locally and globally, really, and that has had an effect, right? I think earlier this year we passed this Great Lakes this Bird Safe Buildings Act, which I think is actually going to have a huge effect for migrating birds. So clearly something's working. And I maybe my message here is just keep that up. Whatever you have been doing, keep up the good work, because I really do see the Chicago Ornithological Society as being a leader in this space. And I think it's, as I said, I think that is a huge game changer for conservation. And then even on a more personal note, as I said, the Chicago birding community has been really kind to me. And more than that, I didn't grow up a birder. I didn't get into birding until college. Nothing about my upbringing really led me, or you would be predictive of me becoming a conservationist, or conservation biologist, I should say. But it was through my interactions with people in this organization and the Chicago birding scene at large that really changed my values and changed who I am and what I want to do with my life. So I just feel on a personal level, if the Chicago birding scene was powerful enough to do that, that it can go ahead and change these laws and change the culture of entire city, and change the culture around bird migration, and thinking about how, I guess, important bird migration is to a city. And so with that, I just want to thank you all. I want to thank the Chicago Ornithological Society for having me. And if you are interested in following any of my work moving forward, feel free to, if you're on Twitter, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mikko Jimenez. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Mikko. That was an awesome presentation. A lot of information to digest there. So yeah, folks, if you have questions, go ahead and slap them in the chat there, and we would love to hear from you. And while we're waiting for folks to type up their thoughts, I'll kind of start with one question I'm just curious about. You mentioned all of these different technologies that are coming together, and there are new ones coming out every day, or new ones being deployed as we speak. I guess I'm just curious, what are you most excited about at this point that's like new or emerging, and its potential to kind of continue to upend our understanding of migration?
That's a great question. And I'll try to answer it succinctly, but because there's so much going on. I mean, one thing that sticks out immediately is our ability. So tracking technology is getting smaller and smaller, and our ability to track passerines, like in the last decade, has expanded so much, right? So because they're obviously you can't put a big tracker on a small bird, but as they get smaller, our ability to track across taxonomic kind of that taxonomic breadth, I guess, is increasing. And so I think that's really exciting. I think there are MODIS tags that can go on birds as small as like kinglets, and there's a lot of kind of that's going on. Like our ability to track smaller birds, I think, is really exciting. I think another thing that's really exciting to me is just the culture around like data sharing and I guess these different organizations. Both of the projects I talked about today are multi-institutional, right? That hasn't always been the case as far as I know. I'm relatively like young in this research game, but I don't think that's always been the case where all these institutions kind of get together and kind of have these huge projects. So there are a lot of those coming out, and I'm really excited about that. I think just thinking about conservation is a collaborative thing by nature, and I think it's really exciting to see some of these huge bird organizations working together on a lot of this.
Yeah. I see a couple of questions in here. So from Akila Lewis, would you like to go ahead and unmute yourself and actually ask your question in person?
Hi, Mikko. Great talk. I love this. And I'm not from Chicago, but it's really interesting learning about different things that happen and occur in Chicago with tracking birds. And my question was, are there ways that the public can better help scientists track birds? So I use eBird, but are there other opportunities for someone who's not really a scientist to get involved or help out?
That's a really good question. You know, I'm not really sure exactly. I know, you know, as part of my job at the for the Migratory Bird Initiative, one thing I do is like I literally reach out to all of these people who are tracking the birds and see if they will share their data with us. Um, I'm not sure how many of them take out volunteers or anything like that, um, but it's like worth asking. I mean, you know, I know it's always kind of like ideal as a researcher to be able to kind of show how your field work actually works. I don't know the degree to which like people would want to take you know volunteers tracking, um, but I don't think it hurts at the very least to like reach out to anyone who you know who's tracking, um, you know, locally, and even if you don't go out with them, just kind of picking their brain about what they do and like why their work is important. I think that's one thing that you can do. Um, I think another thing, you know, and this is maybe indirect, but you know, a lot of these. Oh, I actually came across a number of studies that had like GoFundmes and stuff, right? I think funding is really key here. Tracking technology is not cheap, so you know, if you can donate to some of these research organizations or like a specific project, I think that goes a long way too.
That's a nice brief segue to insert here that COS is going to be installing our first Modus Tower actually over the next couple of weeks here. And we're going to have a big celebration down at Big Marsh Park this coming October 24th. So if you guys want to join us, that's on our website. You can see what that's all about. But yeah, we're one of God knows how many organizations that are expanding this Modus Tower network. And this will actually be the first tower, operating tower in Chicago. Let's see. Alyssa B, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question in person?
Hey, yeah, sure. So, someone recently asked me this question, and I tried my best to answer it, but I really like was pulling at thin air because I have no idea. Um, but since you were talking about birdcast, I was wondering, so let's say migration was hot 2 nights ago, and then birdcast says that the following night, there's very little migration. So does that mean that those birds that had migrated into your area 2 nights ago will hang around for another day? Or do they still migrate, but just to a lesser extent that doesn't show up on birdcast?
This is a really good question. And honestly, I'm still kind of figuring this out. As I mentioned, I'm kind of new to the Birdcast team, but I kind of had this question coming in, like, how do I interpret that exactly? Um, you know, there are limitations with Birdcast. What we see on those kind of high migration nights, we know that there are birds in the atmosphere, but what it doesn't tell us is if they're coming in or if they're departing or if they're coming in. It also doesn't, just because they're in the atmosphere doesn't mean they're going to stop, like it locally, right? And so it's kind of, I guess, maybe the most succinct way to answer this is it's kind of limited. I don't know if like and I don't know if this is exactly your question, but when you see kind of a high migration night, that ideally does mean that like the birds will show up locally or that they'll kind of stick around for a couple of days or a day or so. But that's not exactly the easiest thing to interpret just because of those limitations, because we don't know where exactly they're going to be stopping and we don't know if they're kind of coming or going. Does that kind of help answer that question a little bit, Alyssa?
Yeah, thanks.
No problem.
We got another question here from Michael Callahan. Michael, do you want to unmute yourself, ask that question?
Hey, bud. Good to see you. Excellent talk. In your slide with R squared, it showed a large grouping of years. And about how much data does Birdcast have access to, like year over year? And like, is that year over year data useful in showing an impact of climate change?
Gotcha. So I mean, we, as far as like, on any given, for all of those years, we have all of the, we have every night basically, as far as I understand. I actually don't know how far back that goes. Like, I don't know if that's part of your question too. It's a good question. Again, I'm kind of new to the team, so I don't know how far back it goes in time. This idea of, can we use it to kind of think about climate change, and maybe in particular, I'm not sure if this is also part of your question, but like how bird migration is changing because of climate change. I think that's kind of an active field of research right now. I don't know, if anyone in my lab is looking at that specifically, but that's definitely, I know that that's been talked about. This could be a really good tool for looking at that. So it's kind of a budding field of research. And yeah,
Awesome.
I mean, it's a great idea. Like, I think if we can do that, that'd be really cool to see.
All right. Any other questions? I was also thinking along the climate change lines, especially since we do already know to a limited extent that climate change is going to affect migratory patterns and stuff like that. It'd be really fascinating to see if maybe there's an extent we can kind of already start to see patterns emerging. So I'm sure that'll be some future research that you can come talk to us again at future Birds and Bytes.
Yeah, I'd love that.
All right, I don't see any other questions coming into the chat here, so I think I'll go ahead and wrap it up. First and foremost, thank you so much, Mikko. Really appreciate it. Everybody, round of virtual applause here. Thank you so much for taking the time this evening to talk to us, share your knowledge with us, and obviously really look forward to the future research that you're going to be doing and how it will be helping all of us, both in Chicagoland and nationally, better conserve our birds. I'll also just say once again, we have future Birds and Bytes episodes already scheduled and coming up here. The next one is October 28th. We will be talking about Carolina parakeets on a slightly more morbid level about what happens when we don't understand bird migration and patterns. And again, just head over to our website, chicagobirder.org. All of that is listed there. You can see all the details and sign up for those. I'd also like to point out that once again, if you are not a member of COS at this point, why not? It funds awesome programs like this that are free and open to the public. Plus, that goes into those local efforts that Mikko was talking about, such as the Modus Tower that we're putting up at Big Marsh in the next week and a half here. That is funded by you guys, the members that make it possible to then contribute to this larger data and continental effort to conserve birds. So head on over to our website, give us a shout out. If you have any questions at all, feel free to email us, reach out on social media. But once again, thank you so much for an amazing program this evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, guys.